2018. What a year. LeBron James got swept by Golden State in the finals, even with his gargantuan effort game 1. But hey, at least we got this really good J.R. Smith meme out of it, right? Prince Harry married Meghan Markle, and Elon's SpaceX program launched the most powerful rocket in 45 years. And day 1 of the Pokemon World Championships was absolutely dominated by this deck.
Personally, my experience with that card was playing at Nashville and World Championships, and I played Buzzwole Octillery with Garbodor as a backup attack, and Shrine was an incredibly important part of that deck.
So yeah, at the 2018 Nashville World Championships, Buzzwole in combination with Shrine, Octillery or Garb was really potent in that day 1 Worlds meta. Now, tell you what, it took most people by surprise, but I wasn't surprised at all because I was exposed to this deck a few weeks before and I knew instantly how strong it would be. Now, I remember testing the Celestial Storm format with my good friend Luke Kirkham, who is a terrific Pokemon trading card game player too. Now, his list was a little bit more focused on the Regirock more so than Buzzwole, but it was very clear that basic 1 prizes when paired with Garbodor was really, really strong. But it doesn't stop there though, because the deck wasn't called Regirock or Buzzwole Garb. It was called Buzzwole Garb Shrine.
Shrine of Punishment, great card. Dropping extra damage counters is good.
Looking back at Shrine of Punishment, what an incredible damage mod card this sort of was. The amount of games I've seen where it racked up like 200 damage on its own was pretty common, to be honest, as long as people couldn't bounce it in between turns. The fact that it was in between turns effect was just ridiculous value.
Now, I've always seen Stadium as one of the least most important cards in the deck. Now, granted, they're normally more important than tools, but they're less important than everything else. And sometimes in some formats, like now, for example, you can see some decks that just opt to run 1 or even no stadiums. That's right, I'm looking at you, ADP. So when a stadium makes it into the deck name, and that deck absolutely steamrolls day 1 of the World Championships, you know it's got to be a pretty good stadium card, right? So Shrine of Punishment basically says put 1 damage counter on each Pokemon EX or GX in play in between turns. So if you put a Shrine of Punishment into play and pass, and your opponent has 4 GX or EX in play, they all take 1 damage counter each. Now, granted, that might not sound terribly amazing at face value, but let me run you through this maths. Zoroark Garbodor won Worlds that year. Zoroark's attack Writers Beating topped out at 120 damage, okay, 20 for each one of your Pokemon in play. Now think of it this way. If your opponent has 6 EX or GX in play, which granted wasn't terribly uncommon for back in the day, that's 60 damage in between turns total. When it comes back into your turn, provided the stadium still sticks, that's 120 damage. You haven't even attacked yet. This Shrine of Punishment was obscenely strong. Right, so don't get it twisted. That would rely on your opponent putting all EX or GX Pokemon into play. But with decks like Buzzwole, Zoroark, Rayquaza, trust me, that wasn't too much of an uncommon thing to happen. 120 damage when it comes back into your turn is silly. That's the same as a Zoroark attack.
Shrine of Punishment was definitely a powerful stadium during its time. It went really well in single prize decks like Garbodor decks, Buzzwole decks, and things like that, and it really helped those decks to make up the difference in math against Pokemon GX and EX.
This stadium card on its own put so many 1 prize decks straight into the format. Let's have a look at some of these in a quick fire round.
Obviously Gramble, one of your pet favorites.
Gramble, one of my favorite decks. It did 1 for 160, and then if you had Shrine in play, you could hit something for 160. Bear in mind, Buzzwole had 190, and you could just hopefully leave Shrine in play, and that Buzzwole will get cleared eventually.
Ian was born out of the power of this stadium.
Coco Spread and Persimmon Spread, 2 decks that really lean into the spread aspect of Shrine and just whittling down your opponent, taking multiple prizes, hopefully in 1 turn. We have all the Zapdos variants that all relied on Zapdos moving around the active and then having some other attackers such as Spiritomb or the Ultra Beast backing it up. He's in one of the most strongest, most aggressive spread decks, and this Shrine just made it even more stronger, sometimes acting as the activator damage to get that detention gas to kick in. Oh, okay, fair enough. All of these attackers probably could have been decks in their own right without Shrine. Like I said, Gramble could do 1 for 160. If you add a choice band, that's 190. That's ridiculous. But don't get twisted, Shrine made these decks all much more scary. But I've got 2 more decks for you that I can promise you for 100% could not exist without Shrine of Punishment. And they are bonkers. Let's have a look. So if I was to tell you this Steelix card was one time a top tier meta deck that struck fear into the hearts of some players, I wouldn't blame you for thinking that as well. I mean, granted, 190 HP on a 1 prizer is pretty good, but 3 for 80 plus 40 on a coin flip, that's not getting it done, especially when there's no good metal acceleration in the format. Funnily enough, we're not actually looking at that bottom attack. We look at the top attack, which is just a DCE, 30 damage. Top tier. That's right. So in combination with all the healing cards in formats of today's survival, you would essentially just go 30, 30, 30, and let that shrine, you know, sprinkle damage everywhere. So let's say your opponent takes like 3 or 4 30 damages, right? Then they retreat, set up their next attacker. You're like, okay, 30, 30, 30. And eventually they're going to run out of healing options. And when they do, the Shrine's just going to finish them off. So if this doesn't convince you of how good Shrine is, you've essentially took this DC for 30 attack and made it top tier. And this wouldn't have existed without Shrine. But if you still need convincing, I've got one more deck for you. And boy, it's a doozy. So let me take it one step further. This deck didn't even attack. And it still won games. Didn't even attack. Essentially what you do is try and throw this Hooper into the active. Okay, Hooper was immune to EX and GX Pokemon, so it essentially couldn't be hit for the most part, right? So you just leave that in the active, put a Shrine down and just wait. That's it, you just wait. In combination with Lucamine, which you could argue was the most broken part of this deck, and I'd listen to you, but essentially with Lucamine, you could leave this Shrine of Punishment in play for the whole game, and your opponent's GX, EX Pokemon will get KO'd eventually. It's that simple. Now, if your opponent played, you know, one non-GX attacker, you just use this White Cure, counter ranging, bop it, and then go straight back into your Hooper. So this deck wouldn't even attack, would still take prizes and win games, all because of one Stadium card. I think you'll find it hard to find another Stadium card that has produced so many good, well-performing archetypes than Shrine of Punishment. I just don't think it's possible. But okay, this video isn't just about me gushing over how much I like Shrine of Punishment. So let's look at Path to the Peak.
Path to the Peak completely turns off all abilities for Pokemon with a rule box.
Ever since I've been playing, which is around the base black and white era, Pokemon has always had basic Pokemon that have really good abilities, right? You have Jirachi EX to help you find a supporter. Kind of got a reprint with Tapu Lele with the same ability. You had Shaman EX, which let you draw up to 6 cards in your hand. You had Shaman EX number 2, which lets you draw up to have 6 cards in your hand. You even have Eldegoss, which lets you get a supporter from the discard pile. These basic support consistency Pokemon have always existed in the format, and they're sort of the backbone to almost every deck, being able to always bail you out of a situation, help you draw cards, help you close out games, or try and recover from a bad position. You'd be hard pressed to find decks that don't play any of these Pokemon. And Path to the Peak shuts every single one of them down. Every single one. Don't get it twisted. That's pretty gnarly.
With Path to the Peak, it does have that immediate effect of if you don't remove the stadium, you can't use rule box abilities. But it's definitely more of an immediate effect because it's your opponent needs to remove it right away if they want to use abilities. It's not like they can use the ability, but they take some kind of drawback to it.
All rule box Pokemon in play have no abilities. All rule box Pokemon in play have no abilities? What? Who thought of this? Who thought of this? Now pair that with our new supporter rule, where if you're going first and it's your first turn, you can't play a supporter. If you're going second, you can slam a Path to the Peak down, play a Marnie, reduce your opponent's hand ties to 4, and say, right, you have to replace this stadium and find your consistency stuff, because otherwise you ain't playing this game. That's rather silly.
Whereas Path to the Peak, you're turning off abilities, and I mean, there'll still be the odd matchup where it's no good, but when it is good, it will completely shut down decks, better than the odd KO. Not to mention you got stuff like the Dene, Crobat, etc. that the vast majority of decks played.
So it's hard to accurately measure how impactful this stadium has been. Right, it's only been out for about 2 or 3 weeks, but my good friend Demetrius Eaton won the Sunday Open here with a Path to the Peak deck with Shadow Rider, where essentially you would draw cards, put down Path to the Peak, use Night Watch, reduce your opponent's hand size, and just win the game from there. That Shadow Rider Path to the Peak deck has already won Worlds, funnily enough in 2018, with the Zoro Garb, which is very similar. You draw cards, establish ability lock, and win from there. So we already know this combo is really good. And in that deck, you had to run a stage 1 with tool cards to get your ability lock. With this, just a stadium slot. That's insane. Especially when you consider like a Garb line back then would have been at what? At least like a 4-3, something like this. So let's say you had a 4-3 at 7 cards with about 3 or 4 tools. What's that? 11 cards in your deck dedicated to ability lock. Or, hear me out, you could play 4 stadiums. Sometimes 3 if you're a bit greedy. And that won Worlds. Jesus. Okay, so now we've had a brief introduction to both stadiums. How about we start comparing them, shall we? Celios! What do you think?
The thing about Shrine of Punishment was it was a much more passive effect. And if it was left out for a turn or 2, especially early on, a lot of times the effects were not immediate and the opponent could still play their game however they wanted to. Shrine of Punishment wasn't stopping that, or was more reckless with their GX attackers. They could be punished for that, and they weren't stopped from playing into that punish. Now, with Path to the Peak, there's definitely different layers. With Path to the Peak, it does have that immediate effect of if you don't remove the stadium, you can't use rule box abilities, where Shrine of Punishment was a more passive build-up effect that lets your opponent walk into a punish. And Path to the Peak doesn't necessarily allow for punishing plays as much on its own, but it can be paired with Marnie or Reset Stamp in the current standard, Night Watch in the current standard. I'm sure there will be other hand disruptions and board disruptions in the future that will be able to pair with Path to the Peak. But it's definitely more of an immediate effect because it's your opponent needs to remove it right away if they want to use abilities. It's not like they can use the ability, but they take some kind of drawback to it. So I do think that Path to the Peak is a stronger card.
You know what? What I think Celio said there is really important if you try and compare these 2 stadiums side by side. At least with Shrine of Punishment, you always had the opportunity to play the game. If your hand supported it, you can always just, use an attacker and don't bench any support EX or GX, or only really bench that Lele if you really, really need it. You had options. There was counter play with Shrine of Punishment. You couldn't really lose in one turn due to Shrine of Punishment. However, with Path to the Peak, if your hand doesn't have a good card in it and your opponent slings down a Path to the Peak, or your hand only has the Dene or Crobat in it, you're in trouble. You are stuck. The game is over. Benito, go to game 2, sign the match slip and move on. That's how strong Path to the Peak is. It's actually silly. Now, granted, you can play sort of non-rule box draw engine, stuff like Cincino, stuff like Inteleon. But the sad nature with these is because they're non-rule box, their sort of abilities and power level tends to be a little bit weaker. But not only that, like Cincino's a stage 1, that takes up a lot more deck slots than just like, the Dene or a Crobat, right? Inteleon, that's a stage 2, that needs even more deck slots. So chances of you actually having that in hand can be kind of low. And even then, if you don't immediately draw them, you're still in a bit of trouble.
It's surviving right now in a format with Swell and with Marshadow. And if we look at the early results of Chilling Reign, I know it is still very early, but the 2 most successful decks so far have been Ice Rider Calyrex and Shadow Rider Calyrex. Now, not all of the lists are playing Path to the Peak, but a good number of them are in both of these archetypes. And these are surviving and really taking advantage of this new Stadium card. even with Swell in the game. And I feel like if Shrine of Punishment was played in a meta where Swell was relevant, it would be a far less dangerous card. It wouldn't get nearly as much value at all. And Marshadow is a similar thing where we could sort of recycle that, especially with like Stretcher in that format. People would not allow the Shrine to stick in play. It would still be useful for that extra 1 tick of damage, which was still good enough in a number of decks. But it feels like that Swell is just something that the Shrine of Punishment had to deal with a lot less, and it did still see play in some Swell metas, but far less so, and it was exactly trying to be that 1 damage tick in those latter stages, compared to decks that we saw earlier on in its existence, where you could pretty much build around this with like the best 1 prizes that we had available.
This is an extremely good point too. At the minute, stadiums are really, really contested. Having this Celtic Swelling format, which to be honest could also be in this video. Celtic Swell is an extremely strong stadium. And it's actually a really mean stadium to print Pokemon just after you had Prism Start Stadium, you know what I mean? What this stadium essentially does is says your opponent can't play stadiums. If your opponent replaces the Celtic Swell, you can discard their stadium as well. We also have Marshadow in format, which is a quick ball, level ball, searchable way of just removing a stadium at any given time. So there's like 2 things which are really effective at removing stadiums that aren't even stadiums that your opponent can play, right? So with all of those stadium answers, Path to the Peak is still knocking about in top tier decks and slinging in good results. Path to the Peak is good now, when stadiums are like really under hot contention. How good is it going to be in the post-rotation format when there's no Marshadow and there's no Chaotic Swell? Could be in trouble.
What's on, people? Right, Path to the Peak, Shrine of Punishment, for me, no real competition. Shrine of Punishment, great card, dropping extra damage counters is good, but it's not always going to work, because some decks won't be using the right kind of Pokemon, and even when it does work, those extra damage counters might not get you that key KO. Whereas Path to the Peak, you're turning off abilities, and I mean, there'll still be the odd matchup where it's no good, but when it is good, it will completely shut down decks, better than the odd KO. Not to mention you got stuff like the Dene, Crobat, etc. that the vast majority of decks played, and it's even future-proofed, so whereas Shrine of Punishment became much less good when Vs came out, that ain't happening to Path to the Peak.
And yeah, like Ross just said, there's also the future-proofing aspect to the card. Now, I can't really be too mean to Shrine about this, but there it is, black and white. Shrine of Punishment only works for EX and GX Pokemon. It has no effect on V Pokemon, which is why towards the tail end of it being in format, it really started to see little use. Now, granted, it was still played in like Greens decks, and it did get a lot of play in ADP just to be that extra 1 tick buff that you need for a KO sometimes, but it started seeing a whole lot less play. However, Path to the Peak is permanently future-proofed against all ability rulebox Pokemon. That's pretty gnarly thinking about it moving forward. So yeah, in conclusion, it's really funny because when I had this idea for the video and I started reaching out to people to sort of see what their opinions were and see if they wanted it to be in the video, I was really sold on Shrine of Punishment. I thought that the way Shrine of Punishment really just birthed archetypes, right? Buzzgarb Shrine and the effect that it had on Wells that year. Gramble, Mally Spread, Weezing, Alolan Executor, Tangrowth, Steelix, and then the stall deck as well, where he didn't even attack with Hooper. The fact that it could just create all these archetypes out of nowhere, just from one little stadium, I thought there was a clear-cut case. I was not going to be convinced on Shrine. I thought Shrine was by far the better card. But you know what? After writing this script and hearing what everyone else has to say, I think I have to give it to Path to the Peak personally. Just being able to just sling down the stadium at any time, and if your opponent doesn't immediately have answers, they can just lose the game right there and then. And that is something that Shrine didn't immediately do. Shrine didn't essentially say, replace me right now or you lose. Shrine basically said, you know what? Don't bench too much. Replace him when you can still win this game. That's what Shrine did. It was like a slow ticking timer. You know what I mean? Path to the Peak is like, replace me now or you lose. That's pretty scary. And the fact that a stadium can have so much power is kind of worrying. Hopefully Pokemon gives us some more stadium outs. We have this Punkaboo, which is a bit like Marshadow, but we might need a little bit more. Because in that post-rotation format, when there's no Swell going about, and Marnie is one of the only supporters we can use. If you're going second, you haven't got a chance to play a supporter, and your opponent goes Marnie Stadium, KO attacker. Asking a lot for your 4-card hand, it could get pretty gnarly.